Right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this call, which is hosted by the United Kingdom Post of the Society of American Military Engineers. And we're really excited to be having this call on this great topic today. I'd like to start off by apologising if there's any confusion around the start time. The invites, there's a bit of confusion between time zones on my part, so apologies if that caused any inconvenience. I'd also like to flag that this call is being recorded, so please bear that in mind. So I know we've got folks joining from both the UK and Europe and perhaps further abroad. I'd particularly like to thank the folks at AFIMSC in the UK for hosting a dial-in in their meeting room out at RAF Mildenhall. So thank you to them. And also for their involvement in setting this up. So I'm going to hand over now to Brian Larson, who's our UK Post Treasurer, to introduce our speaker. So over to you, Brian.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Tom. So as Tom said, in UK Post Treasurer, and I've worked with Colonel Spivak in the past. So when this opportunity came up, we thought it'd be a good opportunity to get him out here to talk NATO. So to introduce Colonel Select Ed Spivak is the EUCOM J44 Engineering and Infrastructure Chief, Branch Chief out of Stuttgart, Germany. In this role, Colonel Spivak oversees the EUCOM NATO Security Investment Program, or the NSIP program, for all the U.S. joint forces across the European Command. In a previous role, just about two or so years ago, Colonel Spivak was the base civil engineer at RAF Lakenheath. So he is very familiar with how the U.S. visiting forces operates in the UK and with our DIO counterparts. So Colonel Spivak, appreciate you for volunteering to hold this discussion and look forward to the briefing. Over to you, sir.
Perfect, thank you. If you would allow me right now to start sharing, let me bring up my screen. Nope, it is not letting me bring that up right now. So Tom, can you bring it up on your end, and then I'll just have you change slides for me?
Yes, yep, of course. I'm just sharing the slides now, so they should be with you in a moment.
Perfect, thank you. So as Ryan said, I am the lead for the NATO Security Investment Program for the US here in Europe. My specific role, I am the Capability Management Authority. So I am the direct liaison between the US equities here, the Investment Committee, the NATO Office of Resources, and then both Allied Command Transformation and Allied Command Operations, in ensuring that they get the information they needed to fund all of the operational requirements that support NATO across the theater. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So this is going to give you a quick overview. We're going to start a little bit with where the U.S. is on this policy. There have been some drastic changes over the last 3 to 4 years, both on the U.S. and the NATO side. We'll do a quick overview on what NSIP is, and then we will also go over the new NATO procurement policy, and then go through some of the management functions, where NATO is going in the future for investments, and then some of the limiting factors and where working with NATO is a little different than when U.S. visiting forces tries to execute projects on their own in the UK. So we'll go directly into the next slide. So you see, this is as of November of 2022, the Department of Defense in the US said that we will, wherever possible, use NSIP. This is part of our convergence strategy of ensuring that everything that the US is doing in Europe is aligned with NATO. So while we will have some other smaller projects or the repair and maintenance things that are going on, the majority of the projects that you will see from the U.S. from 23 on, because when this policy came out in 22, it took a while to trickle down, are all going to be in some way related to NATO missions. Next slide, please. So what is NCIP? NCIP pays for alliance capabilities. It's done through their capability program plans. Before they came up with the new governance model back in 2021, they used to be capability plans, which was just a package. So for instance, you would have attack air or air refueling. What they have done is they have streamlined the governance process in order to accelerate how quickly they can deliver these capabilities. What it will do is it'll allow for the restoration and modernization of older facilities as well as new construction for anything that meets the NATO capability categories. So that could be attack air, that could be air refueling, surveillance. For ground, there is pre-positioned stocks. So it could be from munitions facilities to fuel storage facilities, ports, anything operational. What it will not fund the host nation support requirements. For instance, a regular dorm for any airmen or soldiers. It will not provide for a dining facility or a school or anything like that. It is only operational facilities, and it is not the operations and maintenance funds required for sustainment of those facilities. Those still go back to the host nation as the responsibility for maintaining those facilities once they are complete and usable within that NATO capability. Now, back in the Madrid summit in 2022, they had decided that they were going to set a baseline to accelerate this and provide more and more funds each year. Starting with 2023, they had a $1 billion ceiling. Now, I say ceiling because it is not a budget. What they,
hey, welcome on board.
And then somebody has a hot mic.
Master Sergeant Samble and A, the UDM here for Det 4, was able to.
Oh, thank you. With 2023, the $1 billion ceiling, they are going to increase that 25% year over year until 2030. That means each year there will be more and more capabilities available in these capability program plans that will be funded. Now, their funding mechanism is quite different. When the U.S. visiting forces wanted to do construction, we would normally follow our U.S. processes, which would go through approval through Congress, and we needed to have all of the funding available up front before we could start the project. NATO does not do that. NATO relies on bills. So how much over the last quarter has it cost you to do that construction, and then how much do you need for the next quarter? So they don't allocate the funds all at once. It gets divvied out per quarter through the year based on the development of the projects, whether it's in design or construction, and then whatever is put into the NATO system of record to request that amount of funds. That's why it's a ceiling and not a budget, because they are not always sure how much they're going to get back. And one of the ways that they control that is through what they call their tolerances. In the UK, you control that through your risk registry of where you think the costs are going to go up, and they have strict tolerances on time and cost that we'll get to shortly as we talk about the procurement policy, that will affect whether the project will stay on schedule or you're going to have to do additional paperwork in order to continue to get the funds if you fall outside of the tolerances that are set by NATO. I'm going to hold right there on what is NCIP and see if there were any questions about what NCIP is and is not before I move on to the next slide.
Hey, Colonel Spivak, this is Lalit. I used to work in Europe District, so I'm very familiar with the NCIP program. But I have a question now with the new process that you just laid out, which is good to know. I think I'm jumping ahead of your slides. Now, when you say the U.S. is going to look more and more at NCIP, which I totally understand from the administration what they're looking at, my question to you is, you know, the NATO rules were that the host nation by default will execute those projects in the host nation. If the project is in Italy or Germany, the Germans will execute it. Now, will the US interested projects to be funded by NATO, will US also ask for host nation status in some of the countries, or it's going to be case by case basis? Over.
Yes, the U.S. is going to be host nation on projects. So this goes into a little bit of a different realm. Across Europe, we have different agreements with different nations. The Germany and the UK are pretty much set that those territorial host nations will execute the projects unless for some reason they decide that they cannot and would like to defer to the U.S. However, with our new defense cooperation agreements in other nations, we do have the ability to execute those projects. And often those nations, if it's on one of the main operating bases that the U.S. is controlling, we are being asked to execute those projects on those bases. Just for example, even though Italy is an old agreement, there are multiple airfield projects on there that are repaving the taxiways, aprons, where Italy is now allowing the U.S. to do those because it has a direct impact on our mission and deconflicting when and how that construction takes place, where Italy is a little out of that because they're not the ones who have their fighters on those ramps. So the answer is yes, we are doing more in a lot of other nations. For the UK, it will primarily continue to be UK DIO executing all of the ones in the UK and Germany.
Thank you, sir. That's the last thing I will ask you is that, will that mean your statement on the previous slide, will that mean that overseas, all corners, at least in Europe, there'll be less and less MILCON that you envisage? Or like in UK, the Air Force needs to execute some MILCON. Will that all be converted to NSIP, or there'll be some MILCON? Over.
There will be some MILCON. Like I stated earlier, there are certain projects that are considered not eligible by NATO. But the way that the U.S. is going right now is aligning our projects and our capabilities with NATO's, meaning that they should be all NATO eligible, meaning that the majority of the operational projects will be NATO funded primarily. Now, I say that because there's a whole other side to it of deconflicting standards, and those of you in the UK understand this. The US standards and the UK standards don't always align, so there may be a conjunctive funding portion where the US would have to pay for those standards that are above those territorial host nation standards or the minimum military requirement as defined by NATO. So there will be some MILCON associated with it, but the way we are calculating those numbers right now, if I have a $120 million project, about 30 million of that MILCON would come from the US side for the conjunctive funding, and then that other 90 million would be paid for by NATO through the NSIP program. Does that answer your question, Lalit?
Thank you. Really, really great to hear your voice anyway. And I'm totally tracking what you're saying. Thank you.
Hey, sir, this is Matt
We will
Scribner
move on
coming.
Yeah,
Real
go ahead,
quick, it was in the chat, but I'd asked something like a pool or maybe a human performance enhancement center, aka a gym. Could those slip within the definition, or have you seen that those have not? Over.
They have not. The only places where a gym qualifies is where there is a NATO headquarters located there, and there is a requirement by all of the nations for them to have a fitness center. So associated with the NATO command structure adaptation, there are some authorizations for that. So for instance, if it's an OM at JSEC or at SHAPE headquarters or one of the Joint Force Commands, they do have gyms that are associated with them, but at no other operational locations are those authorized.
I assume same goes for pools. Over.
That you would be correct. The same goes for pools.
Thank you.
Okay, on to the next slide, NATO procurement policy. Okay, for the NATO procurement policy, it was updated just recently on 30 June 2025 and has made it through the investment committee. It is awaiting final approval from the NAC right now to make it completely codified in all of their procedures. However, since it made it through all of the other levels of governance and then through the investment committee, which was the final level before going to the NAC, NATO is already starting to implement these changes to the procurement policy. What they're trying to do is increase the flexibility in contracting to accelerate the capability delivery across Europe. They have noticed that a lot of projects have been delayed due to contracting requirements, and that goes into the second two bullets there. One of them was there was a requirement for international competitive bidding. And during that international competitive bidding process, a nation was required to go up to the NATO Investment Committee and then notify every nation that they were going to have a NATO project take place in their country. If you wanted to not do that, you had to get an exemption from the investment committee to use your national competitive bidding process. With the national competitive bidding process, you would use NATO nations internal to you, plus a few external nations that were nearby nations that you would regularly use, but it has to be limited to only NATO nations. One of the other things that this changed, and I was working with DIO Commercial on this, is if you have a mechanism with your contract award for multi-award contracts or your framework contracts, you used to have to do a notification to the investment committee that you were putting this out for NATO nations to bid on. If now you have a system that they can just go into, all you have to let the investment committee know is what that system is that you use that allow those NATO nations to bid on the contract, and then you no longer have to notify them of those framework contracts that you are pushing out. For instance, the US uses sam.gov. We notified the investment committee and all of the nations that we continuously publish all of our multi-award contracts on sam.gov. Because they know that, they can now get into the system and they have the ability to bid on those multi-award contracts. If they choose not to, that's on them, but we no longer have to notify them each time that we're trying to award a new contract. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, this is Lois. Yes, perfect. Thanks.
And then the last part of that in the major changes, it is highly encouraging agile procurement methods, which means they are looking for more of these multi-award contracts where you would have contractors standing by so you can award them faster. You still have to meet the national competitive bidding plus requirement for that. And when you submit the documents that you want the NATO funding or the project proposal, you are going to send them saying, yes, we met national competitive bidding plus, this is how we did the contracting on it, and this is the contractors that we're picking from that are based on that framework contract. So it really does simplify the mechanism for awarding contracts to accelerate the construction. Some things that still apply, you still have to follow all of the NATO governance procedures and make sure all the vendors and materials are coming from NATO contributing nations. So for instance, in the UK or you would not be able to use Ireland because Ireland is not a NATO nation that contributes into the NCIP program or any other nation. That most of the contracts we have seen only come from NATO allies. We have not had anybody else try to bid from outside of that. So it hasn't been an issue thus far. I just need to make sure that everybody understands that you cannot use a nation that's outside of it. And then the other thing that applies still is the NATO financial regulations for disbursement. So the way that they pay for the funding, as I mentioned earlier, with the quarterly increments, that is the way you're going to receive the funding. For the principles of it, so this is outlined in that procurement policy. And if anybody would like it, it is an unclassified document that can be shared on how they do their procurement. one of the top things that they are looking at is their performance and delivery. And I will say this is the thing that is hurting the nations the most, because nations are now having to go to NATO and explain why projects are either delayed or experiencing cost overruns, and then how they plan to rectify that. We'll get into a little bit more of that. I've got that one highlighted because I do have a follow-up slide on that after this, but we'll continue down the list. The fair and open competition, that is using the National Competitive Bidding Plus. You do still have an option to sole source if required, but you need a good explanation to NATO why you would need to sole source. So for some nations, security measures for a facility or for a compound, any cameras or intrusion detection, if there is a specific requirement to use a type of system that nobody else can provide or install due to security reasons, you can use sole source for that. Transparency, that has to do with all of the reporting that's required and making sure the systems are updating. Good governance is using that governance model through the NATO Office of Resources, the Resource Planning and Programming Board, and Investment Committee in order to ensure that all of the NATO funds that are being utilized appropriately and efficiently in order to support the capabilities that NATO is looking for. And then last one is the efficiency and proportionality. So that goes to the minimum military requirements. NATO will only pay for what is required for you to execute that mission. And that is identified in their standards, kind of like the US has our own construction standards, UK, Germany has all of their own. Well, for certain criteria, for instance, an airfield, if you are going over 60 feet from the center line for a certain type of aircraft and you go 61, they are not going to pay for that extra foot past that. Even if it's required by your nation, it would not be funded by them because NATO has determined this is the minimum requirement with risk associated with it for you to execute that mission. And that's where the additional conjunctive funding would come in from any nation that's trying to execute a project if you have something that's above the minimum military requirement of NATO. I'm going to pause there because I covered a lot on the procurement policy to see if there were any questions before I dive deeper into the performance and delivery.
Lucy Lalit again. Will there be a list published, Colonel Spivak, for upcoming projects?
Very good question, Lalit. We do have lists of what is coming. Each time a capability program plan is approved by the North Atlantic Council, they publish the list of approved projects to receive funding in that capability program plan. What we don't typically put out in advance, we do have a whole list of the ones that the U.S. is planning to submit into these capability program plans. So right now we have closed out Air Basing 1. We have a really good understanding of what's going to be funded in Air Basing 1. We have our proposed projects for Air Basing 2, which is still very fuzzy because that doesn't have any feedback yet from NATO or the nations. And then coming up for facilities and logistics operations, that's where we have a lot of the munitions facilities, pre-positioned stocks. As the US, we have over 350 projects across Europe that we plan to submit in that capability program plan. That is going to be a very extensive, very large project. We do have multiple lists. The ones that are official, though, like I said, are the ones that are in the capability program plans as they get approved by the North Atlantic Council.
Excellent. We'll figure it out. Sir, the last thing, another thing was, forgot now, the NCIP-funded projects in any NATO countries, are they covered by SOFA for US?
I'm not sure if I understand that question completely.
US is a host nation. Let's say the US is a host nation in Poland, and US is executing the project. I think I might know the answer already, but is NCIP funded? Like we did the APS autism project in Poland or whatever. Will the U.S., when they execute that project, NSIP funded, we're still covered under SOFA, like the people, like the protection, all that stuff?
I understand. So that does not fall into the NSIP program or the procurement policy. When you talk about the SOFA or the status of the personnel in order to execute the construction or the contractors, that is a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and that nation to allow those personnel, material, and everything to enter. So that links into the person who sits right next to me in the office, Mr. Rob Hengst, who works with a lot of those bilateral agreements to ensure that we have the access and ability in order to execute those projects. That leads into also, as we were discussing earlier, the determination of who will be the host nation that is going to execute the project. If we don't have regular access or the ability to do the construction, then us as the U.S. would normally request that whoever that territorial host nation is do it on our behalf, which they are. Nobody has said no to us on that yet, because there is two separate levels. There's the bilateral discussion and then the NATO construction portion of it for the capability delivery.
So thank you.
Okay, moving on to the next slide. Performance and delivery. Now there are a lot of words on this slide, but what the most important part of this is that as you come up with the cost estimates and you determine what the tolerances are or the risks or contingencies, whatever you want to call, with the construction of the project, you need to define that very well at the beginning, because you are going to give a timeline of when you expect to need those NATO funds incrementally by quarter over what you project to be the lifespan of the project. And if you exceed those risk tolerance numbers, either the cost or time, it's going to go back to a RAP. That's a remedial action plan. Those remedial action plans could take up to a year for NATO to approve the increase in funding. So if you run out of money from NATO and you have not completed that RAP and it hasn't been approved by NATO, that stalls the project. That's where it's imperative that the cost estimating, time, and risks are well defined up front. You know what they are, can express them to NATO. And I will say, because NATO is the one that determines if that is acceptable or not, you may not get your full contingency or tolerance that you ask for. If you're asking for 12% on it because you think it's a high risk project, they may only approve 10% or 8%, in which you still need to stay within those NATO tolerances then. And if you exceed them, then once again, you still have to follow their RAP procedures and explain to them why you were outside of the tolerances they determined. It's no longer an internally controlled by the one nation, because they're trying to control the amount of funds and be sure that they've got a good projection to spend up to their authorized amount each year and not exceed that. Exceeding the amount of funds for a project in that 1 year may cause another project to not get approved by NATO, which may be in another country, for another capability that's also needed. So once again, going back, accuracy, tolerances, and that risk registry is extremely important, with accurate updating that must be done monthly in the NATO system of record to explain where you are on timeline and cost. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions and comments on the performance and delivery. Okay, with that, we'll move on to the next slide.
Colonel Spivak, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Is there a standard template for that remedial action plan? Is that something that could be shared, you know, not to plan for failure, but at least we could have it in our lexicon to be able to pull out, so we're not wasting any more time even trying to come up with the plan? Over.
We will get I can get a copy of that to you. We're actually working through our first one for the US on that right now for a Navy project in Italy. So once we have that all the way through, we can share a copy of what that is. It is a fairly extensive document and is not easy to produce. It is much easier if you get your tolerances and risks right up front and then do not have to go through that process. But we can get a copy of the one that we're working through now as soon as it's complete.
Having your hat in your hand is never a fun place.
You are correct.
Never having your hat in your hand is always better than having to do that. But thank you for your response.
You're welcome. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a quick projection of what the NATO funding looks like compared to what the U.S. has projected. So this is just our air projects from EUCOM across all of Europe. If we took our entire fiscal development plan, like what we're trying to do between now and 2031, and if we got every funded project from the US, that's that light blue section at the bottom. The amount of funding that's going to be available by NATO for capabilities is that dark blue area that you see exponentially increasing up to 2030 and then leveling out, because that's where they project to stay from 2030 on unless there is a new agreement. So there are a lot of funds available, and that's one of the reasons when I was meeting with DIO Commercial, they are also interested in this because the UK also significantly contributes to NATO with all the capabilities. How can they access those funds? So I see the UK also starting to use the NCIP program more as the availability of funds and the increased eligibility comes to fruition over the next few years to deliver capabilities to NATO. Are there any questions on this chart or that information?
There one more time, if you can explain that the light blue represents what?
Those are all of the U.S. Air Force projects in Europe that were in our MILCOM program.
I see.
Per year.
I see. Yeah, it's massive. The dark blue. Okay, thank you.
Okay, next slide. Okay, this is where I wanted to cover a little bit of the different instruments. Most of what we have been talking about thus far has been the major works projects. Those are the things that go into the capability program plans. You see in the comments it says capability packages there, and then or capability program plans. Capability packages were the old way of doing it. Those are now gone, so we still have some that we need to close out, but anything new will be submitted in a capability program plan. The timelines could be anywhere from 1 to n years. What they are looking for is as they approve that plan, when do you plan to start it? So just an example, we have a bunch of projects that the US has worked with the UK that we are trying to do at Fairford, and we have timeline increments. Some of those are expected to start in 25, some in 26, some in 27, but they all get approved at once, and then you know that it's eligible for NATO funding for the out years going out. If those timelines change from what's approved in that capability program plan, then we need to notify NATO in advance so that they can look at their financials and adjust them accordingly for any other projects that may be able to be brought forward. For the minor works do not need to go into a capability program plan, but they do need to meet the requirements of that plan. So for instance, if I need to do a full airfield mill and overlay, and it's going to cost me over the 3 million euro, let's say it's going to cost me 8 million euro, it needs to go into that major works and get approved through the capability program plan. But if I'm going to just do an apron space that's about 1.5 million euro, I can immediately submit a minor works at any time to support that capability and get it approved through a separate process and start right away. The timeline for them to approve those minor works packages is typically 60 to 90 days from when it's submitted to them. So you will see a lot more projects. EUCOM is already working on this. We started to get some from the Army and Navy as well for these smaller 3 million euro and less projects to be executed immediately that deliver some sort of capability that aligns with an already approved capability program plan. And then the last one there are urgent requirements. So urgent requirements are some drastic changes that immediately affect operational capability. That means like we have a pier in Sigonella. There's a pier in Sigonella that got damaged, and we need it in order to do our operations. We need it fixed now. It is still over that $3 million, estimated at $10 million worth of repair, but we push that urgent requirement directly into NATO. They approve it, and they approve the funding immediately. We have to start that construction within 90 to 180 days. And this is where those contracting mechanisms are absolutely essential. When there is something that needs to be fixed, we can get that urgent requirement, but we need those contracts let immediately and execution to start within those 90, 180 days, even if that's just getting the design going to start expending those funds that are authorized by NATO. That means quick, accurate data on those risks and tolerances, accurate cost estimates and timelines for start. And if we cannot start within those 90 to 180 days, then we cannot get it approved through this NATO urgent requirement process. And that's where we end up leaving money on the table that we can't get to fix immediate needs. Are there any questions on those before I just hit on that last crisis response?
Hey, Colonel, the pre-finance only applies to minor works, or can it also apply in urgent cases that U.S. spends MILCON money and then recoup it like they've been doing all this time? Over.
Good question. We can do pre-financed works with an urgent requirement as well. For instance, not to get into too much detail, that is something that we are doing at RAF Lake and Heath right now, where we have pre-financed work, and then we have submitted an urgent requirement for NATO to give us that money back because of how quickly we needed to do some construction projects there that have not been accepted into a capability program plan yet, and that is already working through the wicket. So you can associate urgent requirements with the major MILCON works as long as that you have the justification, urgent need for it, and and NATO approves it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. You have a few questions in the chat. Not sure if you can see them. Mr. Matthew Clear said, could you please confirm where and when the list of projects will be available so potential suppliers can review, prioritize, and respond?
Yep, well, we will get into that a little bit on the next slide when we start talking about the capability program plan packages and some of the timelines, and then we'll let you know where that is. So I'll hit that on the next slide.
Okay, and then Matt, I don't know if you want to ask your question.
Yes, sir. Can environmental remediation or utility upgrades be considered an urgent requirement? Over.
Environmental remediation, no. Utility upgrades, yes. We are doing utility upgrades urgent requirement for some piers right now for the Navy, where they don't have the proper electrical and it's deteriorated. So electrical utilities, yes. Once again, just look at the cost threshold. If it is under that $3 million, then we would just submit a minor works. If it's over the $3 million, then we would submit an urgent requirement.
Okay, thank you.
And then finally, that very bottom box there, the crisis response operations urgent requirement, that is if NATO determines that a mission is authorized by NATO, meaning Article 5 has been declared. So this has happened in the past with the Afghanistan mission. NATO did declare Article 5. When NATO supported in Afghanistan, they did approve a bunch of projects under the crisis response operational urgent requirement in order to establish the proper infrastructure to support that crisis response at the time. So that last one doesn't have any of the timelines or information there because it does meet it's the same as the urgent requirements one, but it is only associated with authorized operations from NATO, and that can be inside or outside of NATO nations just because it is for crisis response only. With that, we will move on to the next slide to go over some of the timelines. So first off, we have some of the NSIP stuff in the UK. In Airbasing 1, you will see that we have 14 projects that are expected to be NATO projects in the UK, including at Fairford, Mildenhall, and Lakenheath. Just below that, you will see our timelines of when things are expected. And I'm going to talk through the acronyms a little bit on this so you understand what it is. Under the product, the top line, the operational requirement statement, that's where NATO tells the nations, this is the operational requirement we want you to develop. So that's where they developed Airbasing 1. And then in that small box under where you see Airbasing 1, you see it's the DABs, the storage, the bombers, ISR capability, rapid airfield damage repair, F-35s, all of that stuff fit into Airbasing 1. Airbasing 1, because it started a while ago, was based on the NATO graduated response plans, not on their newer regional plans. So not all projects we submitted to them for that were picked up because it didn't meet the graduated response plan requirement that was outlined in this capability package. The PDS highlighted one is your project data sheet. That's how we submit the projects to NATO. In US speak, that it's like a 1391 or just a basic summary. It's a 2-page document that says this is the project, this is the scope, this is how it supports NATO's mission. Here are the costs, the tolerances, the risks that are associated with that, and that all gets sent into NATO for them to authorize it. Then they go through the CPP timeline, and that's where they are authorizing and approving each one of these projects. Airbasing 1 was supposed to be approved already. However, NATO did not get that through their governance model before they broke for the summer break. So that one will be going in for approval through the governance process in September to try to be finally approved no later than January by the North Atlantic Council for all of the projects in Airbasing 1 for the next 5 to 10 years. Airbasing 2, if you notice that all the information is the same in what it's covering, however, it's based on the new regional plans where, for instance, Mildenhall, while we did get a project into Mildenhall, Mildenhall is going to fall more in Airbasing 2 because it supports the regional plans more than the graduated response plans. The timelines for that, right now, we are waiting for information back from the military committee on the operational requirement statement. So the timelines are a little bit off. They are still delayed on that. We're expecting, once again, by about October timeline, we'll have all of that information back. And then sometime in Q3 to Q4, probably about December timeframe is when we would start submitting the projects for Airbasing 2 across the theater. Facilities for logistics operations, that's the one that I mentioned earlier, that we have over 350 projects. The majority of them are for Army projects for ground operations. Those timelines did shift. You'll notice that big gap in calendar year 25. That's because they came out with the operational requirement statement and said, this is what we want the nations to start to construct. And then they realized it was way too big to approve all at once. So what they're going to do is in the capability packages for that operational requirement statement, they're going to have multiple ones. One of them that'll be on pre-positioned stocks. One of them will be on munitions. One of them will be on the minimum operating requirements. So those timelines are going to be forthcoming, but those will not start until sometime about March, April of 26. And we can provide updates on that as we get them back from NATO, but won't know any real new projected timelines until after they return from their summer recess. And the last one I wanted to capture down there is the surety one, because that is very specific to the UK. That one is going through processing right now. for the approval of all of the future projects there in the UK. So the answer to the question previously, as soon as that capability program plan is approved by the North Atlantic Council, they publish them. They get sent out to every one of the nations. The UK representative for that is Mr. Scott Woods. He receives that directly. It also goes to DIO Commercial. They should also be receiving that. And then from there, anybody can get those lists. Once they are approved, we share them directly with every one of our component commands. So for USAFE, Mr. Ben Ritzma, or the NSIP representation there, they will get a copy of it. And I am sure now that we have representation from AFIMSC, we're also going to be sending it directly over to you as well. Also goes to the Army, Navy, it goes to each of our DCAs for them to see. But if anybody else is not on that list or can't reach it through your national representative, you can always reach out to us, and we are more than willing to share those lists as they become available.
Hey, Colonel Spivak, this is Brian Larson. Just a quick question. So, you know, I see these kind of 3 or 4 CPPs here. What happens when, you know, next year new requirements come up that are NATO eligible after the current CPP timelines have closed out in airbasing 2, for instance? Is this going to be, because this is kind of like a big catch-all front of the like tranche, and then is there going to be a reoccurring program, kind of like a FIDEP type requirement for future years?
No, Brian, I get that question a lot because it is very different from how the U.S. does business, where we look at each year and then we project another 5 years. Once they approve this capability program plan, it is locked, and they usually don't readdress it with an addendum to it or do another level of it for another 5 years. So that's why we push very hard on everybody identifying those requirements up front and submitting those packages, because if it's not approved in there, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get it added until they relook at that capability again, which doesn't happen typically for 5 more years.
Thank you.
I have a question, which was right in the first bullet, all of this process through UK MOD. I thought that especially the U.S. interest projects, U.S. could have been U.S. MILCON, but in this case, U.S. NSIP in UK, will they have to go through DIO, or is there a push from policy OSD to UK policy that they would like to bypass DIO and do it direct? Is there such thing going on out there?
No, right now, all projects are pushed through due to the way our arrangements and agreements are with the UK, all of our projects get pushed through the UK MOD, and they are the ones that submit them to NATO in the UK. Even if we want to go it on our own and the US wants to execute those projects, we still need UK MOD to concur on that. And then they would, instead of sending it up to NATO directly, they would do a concurrence that the US can be the host nation on that, send it back to me as the capability management authority, and then I would send it through our national representative into NATO governance that way. It always has to go through the UK at some level for concurrence or processing in the UK, just because of the way we do our agreements there. And every country is different. Some countries allow us to submit them direct. Some of them do not want us to. So that goes back to the bilateral discussion.
Thank you.
This is Jana Warner. So just to add on to that, yes, everything does go through MIB DIO as far as being processed in the UK. And the actual execution of that, we are currently working through a bilateral military forum process and the cost sharing arrangement discussions, and resolving a lot of issues in the program at large, not just on the NSIP portion of it, but we are working through those that will then also impact the NSIP program, so that we can ensure all projects are executable under the NSIP rules, and that we are able to incorporate US, UK, and NATO requirements in everything that we're doing. So there is still some flux here on how they will actually get executed, and we're working through some of those questions right now. But yes, back to your point, the initial approval from NATO does come through MOD, and then the execution, IMSC and DIO are working through how do we actually get them done.
Yep. Thank you for that, Gianna. And if there are changes to how we do things in the future due to changes in the USVF to UK relationship, we can always change those processes. But the specific question that Lala was at, this is the way it is done now. Look forward to any updates on changes as they occur, and we will adjust our processes in due time as any agreements or other process changes are agreed between the U.S. visiting forces and the UK. Okay, on to the last slide. That is all I have to give an update on how we are currently executing the NCIP program and some of the changes to the procurement policies and how we're dealing with NATO. I'll open it up to the floor right now for our last 8 minutes to see if there are any other outstanding questions.
I think it'll be right for the audience to think that what you're messaging here, which is excellent, by the way, thank you so much, and Tom for organizing it, or whoever got this topic on the calendar there. The messaging that, hey, stand by, looks like the NCIP program is the way to go for US at least. And if I remember, at the NATO meeting, last NATO meeting, I mean, UK even went up with their spending future. So I'm pretty sure that everybody's going to be looking at NCIP funding. Is that a right conclusion, Colonel, that we got from you?
Yes. So nations will still continue to do their own national investment. Yeah. So I expect that from the UK, Germany, and everybody else. However, where applicable, and because it meets the NATO operational requirements, all nations are increasing their participation and use of the NCIP program. It's not just a US-UK thing. It was an agreement at the Madrid summit that they were going to increase the amount of common funding available for nations to develop these capabilities faster. So all nations are starting to utilize it a lot more. And I will give another example of that, of the first German Germany Army Brigade that is now getting stationed in Lithuania, where they are using NCIP funds. They just had a news report on how NCIP was helping fund, or NATO was funding, this new compound for German forces to be in another country. And all of that is coming from this common funded capability through NATO in order to accelerate the delivery.
Thank you.
Right, but just thinking.
Hey, sir, we have a question for the room here. Go ahead, Major Roscoe.
Hey, sir. Sorry, off the wall question, but when we're talking capabilities, the majority of NATO countries are obviously in Europe, but we do sort of have the States and Canada. If they were to try and, I don't know, snipe a specific capability, would a project in the Western Hemisphere be eligible for NCIP funding? Over.
Good question. Yes, it is possible. However, with the minimum military requirement determination through NATO, it needs to be above and beyond what you would normally be responsible for your own national protection. So for instance, us trying to do an airfield at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, or trying to do something that is for our own national defense and mission, would not be eligible. We are in the process right now. The U.S. has agreed with NATO years ago that we were going to have in the NATO command structure JFC Norfolk in the U.S., and NATO is funding that project completely to the orders of over $1 billion new headquarters with supporting infrastructure in the U.S. We're also looking at other port capabilities that supply munitions, material, and other assets to Europe through NATO that they're procuring, and those port capabilities may be eligible because that's above what is needed for our national defense and is support of the alliance. So yes, there are things in the Western Hemisphere that could be eligible. We just have to make sure that it is above what would be our own national responsibility before we request that from NATO to pay.
Good question.
Hey, Kron, who determines which NCIP projects go to NSPA?
That's a good question. So right now, it is the host nation for the project that can determine if they give it to NSPA, or an agreement between the host nation for the project and NSPA as the host nation. So NSPA can be designated as a host nation for a project outside of the normal territorial host nation requirements. Right now in the US, we are working through the authorities for potentially using NSPA. And why is that? That's because for some of the projects that we're trying to do, it's bigger than an installation is capable of doing on their own, but too small for our DCAs to want to pick up because they don't see the benefit and the return on doing the project. So right now there's nobody that can do that, but we still need authorization from OSD to go outside of our typical DCAs to execute a project like that.
Thank you. You know, I'm tracking a project in Kosovo very, very closely. But I mean, don't want to criticize anybody on the call, but it's not easy to get into the NSPA system and, you know, do all the necessary stuff to bid on a project. But just situational awareness. But now I understand. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lalit. Any final questions?